But first, today, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers announcing an overhaul of the RBA, how it operates and how it sets the cash rate. He handed down a highly critical review, urging a generational overhaul of our central bank.
This review that I'm releasing today is not about taking shots at anyone. It's not about one decision or one piece of advice or even one set of decisions. This is about making sure we've got the right combination of objectives and structures and processes and people to make the right decisions, difficult decisions, into the future. We don't want there to be any element whatsoever of politicisation when it comes to the Reserve Bank. There is some commentary and analysis about the making of monetary policy in recent years. I'll encourage people to check that out, but my job is very different, not to second-guess decisions taken, but to make sure we have the best combination of transparency and independence and expertise so that we have a world-class Reserve Bank into the future.
Among the 51 recommendations, splitting the RBA board into two. There'd be one monetary policy board that would set the cash rate. There'd be 8 cash rate decisions a year, not 11, not one on the first Tuesday of every month. There'd be mandatory press conferences after each cash rate decision to improve transparency and communication. Climate change transition should not become the RBA objective, the review found. Removing the power for the Treasurer to overrule the RBA decisions would also be among the changes. There'd be an inflation target of 2 to 3%, that would remain. All of these changes, if backed by the Parliament, would take effect July 2024. RBA Governor Philip Lowe responded to these critical findings today.
The idea that the board members sit there meekly and accept the recommendation that I put to them is very far from the reality that I've lived as the governor. So that part of the review discussion didn't really resonate with me. But I do hear them and they say, well, they would like to see more monetary policy and financial expertise on the board.
Looking at how the RBA has performed in recent years, there's no question it's got it wrong and let Australians down. Philip Lowe said there'd be no interest rate rises before 2024, encouraging Australians to take out mortgages. Instead, there have been 10 consecutive interest rate rises. He was also too slow to start tackling inflation. Other central banks were raising rates long before we started. These errors are very serious, and there is a need for more accountability and transparency. But there are concerns about the recommendations from this review. In one of the biggest and most controversial changes, full employment would become the equal goal of the RBA along with tackling inflation. Economists have already spoken today, including in private conversations I've had with some very senior economists today. They say this could be very problematic, and here's why. The RBA has historically had just one objective, inflation, and it has had one instrument to tackle this, interest rates. If you have to bring down inflation and it's not in conflict with employment, then you wouldn't need employment as an objective in the charter of the RBA. But if you have to bring down inflation and it is in conflict with the RBA's new goal of full employment, well, the prevailing wisdom is you couldn't let inflation run. It has to be the top priority, not jobs. Otherwise, you'd end up with entrenched inflation and you'd need an even bigger stick to bring it down. So adding full employment to the charter along with inflation, as this review suggests today, this is highly problematic and it is unnecessary. It's a point that highly respected economist Bill Evans made on Sky News with Ross Greenwood just a moment ago.
Very, very difficult to define a number for full employment. I think that's the problem. We all have a differing view on where full employment is. We think about the so-called NAIRU, that's the level of unemployment below which prices are stable, but below which you get inflation. So I think it's very difficult to define that number, but it does suggest to me that they have two very specific targets now, and it's always difficult to achieve two targets when you only have the one instrument, and that's going to be the difficulty the Reserve Bank has. I think that the inflation target is much better.
There you go. Bill Evans, highly respected economist, saying the inflation target is much better than adding a second one of full employment. But now to the best part, the good parts about the review recommendations. And the top is that there'll be more transparency. Introducing more accountability is definitely needed at the RBA. It might have prevented the governor from misleading Australians when he said there'd be no rate rises. The dual structure in setting up a monetary policy board with specialists in the field, separate from the governing board, this also makes sense. The biggest problem with the RBA is that it's a one-man band. And the board is often made up of business people who might at times barely understand the reasons behind changing the cash rate. They wouldn't have the expertise or authority to challenge the RBA governor or present a counter view. But in setting up a board of monetary policy specialists, there's now the problem of how to actually find the experts to sit on this board. The pool in Australia is shallow, and you need experts to challenge the governor, but who would they be? Critics also say the RBA review is a political stitch-up. Economics journalist Adam Crichton, he says there's no major problems with how the RBA is currently operating. He says these changes are just a matter of jobs for mates and more bureaucracy. And he's going to join me on the program tonight to give his view, and so will Sky business editor Ross Greenwood. Now, Philip Lowe has said he wants to stay on as the RBA governor, or he would be happy to continue serving when his term expires in September. He also doesn't accept the criticism that's implicit in this entire review. He said he doesn't take it personally. He makes the point that no other central banks in other countries have done better than Australia. They've all been dealing with high inflation post the pandemic.
I don't take it personally because I'm just one person in an institution that every single day tries to do the best job for Australians. We don't always get it right, but we always try to get it right. We've all been dealing with exactly the same things. Inflation being too low, kind of doing too much during the pandemic, wondering how that was going to work out in our high inflation. So I think that's the reality. We're all the advanced economies are dealing with exactly the same things. And no matter what structure you have at the central bank, you have to deal with those things. And I think it's not correct to say that a different decision-making structure would make fundamentally different outcomes in these areas.